On the afternoon of November 30th, 1939, Marshal Afanasievich Meretskov entered Joseph Stalin's office in Moscow with the confidence of a man who had just been handed a simple mission. H-42 Mahetsk was one of the most experienced generals in the Red Army, a veteran of the Russian Civil War and the Spanish Civil War. The task Stalin had assigned him seemed, at least in the Politburo's analysis, essentially trivial. Finland, a country of 7 million people to the northwest of Leningrad, had refused Soviet territorial demands. The Red Army, with its 450,000 men, its 6,500 tanks, and its 3,800 aircraft, would force Finnish compliance within 2 weeks, 3 at most. 12 weeks later, Marshal Semyon Timoshenko was staring at the same map Meretskov had studied with such confidence. Around him, along the Mannerheim Line, lay 750 destroyed Soviet tanks. There were more than 126,000 Soviet soldiers dead, wounded, or frozen to death in temperatures of minus 40 degrees Celsius. And there was something more disturbing than the numbers. There was a nation of 3 million people that had resisted the second largest army in the world for 105 days, using a field force of 300,000 men, without modern tanks, without competitive fighter aviation, and with ammunition stocks that had been calculated to last 3 weeks at most. The distance between these two scenes, Meretskov's confidence in November and Timoshenko's silent devastation in March, reveals one of the most catastrophic military underestimations of the 20th century. And the reasons behind that underestimation, rooted not in simple intelligence failure, but in ideological assumptions that made certain truths about Finland literally impossible to process, explain why the Soviets not only lost the Winter War on tactical terms, but why they repeated the same mistakes repeatedly, paying repeatedly the same price in blood. This is the story of how the Red Army learned to fear the Finnish forest, and why the average Finnish soldier was the single most effective weapon per number of men fielded by any army participating in the Second World War. The roots of Soviet confidence regarding Finland were multiple and mutually reinforcing in ways that made self-correction almost impossible. The first factor was geographical and historical. Finland had been part of the Russian Empire until the Revolution of 1917. Soviet leaders knew it, or believed they knew it, as an extension of Russia, a piece of the old imperial territory that had, by accidents of history, momentarily escaped Moscow's control. This view made it impossible to take Finland seriously as an independent political and military entity with capabilities of its own. The second factor was ideological. Marxist-Leninist doctrine taught that a nation's strength derived from its working classes and its means of production. Finland was a small, agrarian country with limited industry and a working class whose true interest, according to Soviet analysis, lay with the Soviet Union, the Finnish Communist Party. Though marginalized, existed and provided Moscow's strategists with a kind of illusion of latent internal support that would burst into open welcome once the Red Army crossed the border. Stalin believed, or allowed himself to believe, that the Red Army would be received not as an invader, but as a liberator. Finnish workers would take to the streets to greet Soviet soldiers. The Helsinki government would fall to internal pressure. The campaign would be military only in appearance. In reality, it would be a slow-motion surrender by a ruling class isolated from its own people. The third factor was the purge. Between 1936 and 1923 of the Army's 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 50 of 57 corps commandeurs, an estimated total of 35,000 officers. The generation of military leaders with genuine experience in complex command had been eliminated. Those who survived had survived, largely, because they proved sufficiently deferential to never contradict analyses coming from above. The result was a command system where true information contradicting, Moscow's expectations tended to disappear before reaching decision-makers. Intelligence reports on Finnish military capabilities that reached Stalin before November 1939 were not unfavorable to the Soviet view because Soviet agents couldn't collect accurate information. They were unfavorable because accurate information was filtered, minimized, or simply discarded at each level of the command chain before reaching the top. No Soviet officer who wanted to keep his position and his life had any incentive to present Stalin with an assessment that contradicted his expectations. What Stalin didn't know, or wouldn't let himself be told about. Finland constituted a complete argument for the impossibility of the quick conquest he had ordered. Finland in 1939 was not simply a small country with a small army. It was a small country that had built, methodically and over decades, a relationship with its own territory that transformed every forest, every lake, every snowy plain into a force multiplier for the defender. Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, Commander-in-Chief of the Finnish Army, was one of the most experienced military officers in Europe. Austrian by birth, Finnish by choice, he had served in the Imperial Russian Army during the First World War and had commanded Finnish government forces. During the 1939, Mannerheim had spent 2 decades studying how a small nation might defend itself against the only credible threat surrounding it, the Soviet Union. The defensive line Mannerheim had built on the Karelian Isthmus between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga was not a product of improvised genius. It was the result of meticulous planning, resource scarcity accepted with pragmatism, and a deep understanding of how Finnish terrain denied the advantages the Soviets, on paper, possessed. The Mannerheim Line was not a series of impressive bunkers. It was a defensive zone that used terrain as its primary feature. With concrete bunkers, only where terrain alone was insufficient, but the line was only part of the Finnish answer. The other part was the individual soldier, and here is where Soviet underestimation met its most devastating refutation. The average Finnish soldier of 1939 was something conventional military planning had not adequately categorized. A civilian who was also, through the combination of compulsory military service, a hunting culture, and an intimate relationship with the natural environment dating back generations, an extraordinarily effective forest warrior. Every Finnish male citizen had passed through compulsory military service. More importantly, most had grown up hunting, skiing, and navigating terrain the Soviets would find completely alien. Temperature was the factor that Moscow's planners either didn't know or chose to ignore. The Finnish winter of 1939 to 1940 was one of the most severe of the century. Temperatures reached -40 degrees Celsius. For a poorly equipped Soviet soldier, frequently recruited from more temperate regions of the Soviet Union, sent into combat with equipment inadequate for those conditions, the Finnish cold was an independent weapon. For a Finnish soldier equipped with proper clothing, familiar with movement through deep snow, and trained in Arctic survival techniques, those same temperatures were simply normal winter. The first weeks of the conflict were a Soviet disaster of dimensions that Moscow would spend decades minimizing in historical records. The Soviet 44th Rifle Division, sent to cut Finnish communications north of Lake Ladoga, advanced in road column on December 11, 1939, a formation that any properly trained officer would know was suicidal in forested terrain with mobile defenders. The division had 15,000 men, 140 tanks, and heavy artillery. It was, on paper, an overwhelming force for anything Finland could put in its path. What happened on that road has been studied in military academies around the world in the decades since, as a paradigmatic example of how an inferior force can destroy a superior one using terrain and mobility. The Finnish forces that conducted the destruction of the 44th Division totaled approximately 11,000 men, without tanks, without significant heavy artillery, but they moved on skis through forests the Soviets could not penetrate with their vehicles. They knew every trail, every clearing, every frozen lake that could serve as an attack or withdrawal route. And they used a tactic that would become known as motti, from the Finnish for a cubic meter of cut firewood, which involved isolating sections of the Soviet column and destroying them separately before they could support each other. Within 2 weeks, the 44th Division had been split into 16 separate pockets, each surrounded and being methodically destroyed. Soviet tanks, unable to maneuver off the road through deep snow, were vulnerable to Finnish soldiers on foot who approached from angles no vehicle could reach. Molotov cocktails, the ironic designation chosen by the Finns in response to Molotov's claim that Soviet aircraft were dropping bread over Finnish workers, were the primary anti-tank weapon in many engagements. Glass bottle, cloth, gasoline. Against Soviet tanks paralyzed in the snow, they worked. When the battle ended in mid-January 1940, the 44th Division had lost 14,700 men dead, wounded, or frozen. It lost 1,300 prisoners. It lost all of its tanks, all its heavy artillery, and all its support equipment. Finnish losses in the same engagement totaled 750 dead and 1,500 wounded. The casualty ratio, approximately 11-1 in Finland's favor, was extraordinary enough to strain credulity. Except that it had been witnessed by neutral observers and documented in Soviet archives, opened decades later. General Georgiou, after the war, described the central problem with the directness that would make him the finest Soviet general of World War II. We sent infantry into the Finnish forest as if they were conventional army soldiers. The Finnish forest was not an obstacle between 2 points. It was the primary terrain of combat. And we didn't know that terrain. The Finns didn't just know it, they lived in it. Finnish sniper Simo. He became the individual personification of the devastation the average Finnish soldier could inflict on the Red Army. His story is simultaneously fascinating and disturbing, and was extensively analyzed by Soviet intelligence without that analysis producing any effective solution. He was 34 when the Winter War began. A farmer from a small holding near the Soviet border, he had grown up hunting in the forests that were now becoming a battlefield. His skill with rifles was well known in Finnish sporting circles, where he had accumulated numerous titles in target shooting competitions. When the war began, he picked up his Finnish Mosin-Nagant rifle, refused to use a telescopic sight because the lens might reflect sunlight and betray his position, and went into the forest. Over the 100-day period of the Winter War, he accumulated a confirmed kill count that remains controversial precisely because it seems impossible. Estimates range between 500 and 700 Soviet soldiers killed, with most sources converging around 500 confirmed deaths. The number is not, by itself, the most disturbing element for military planners. It is the consequent element to killaga, iaga. The Soviets tried targeted artillery strikes, specialized counter-sniper teams, and mass offensives designed to make any position untenable. Nothing worked for 100 days. He was finally incapacitated on the war's last day by a rifle shot that removed part of his face. He survived, recovered, and lived until 2002, aged 96. His importance lies not in the numbers, which are extraordinary but represent only a fraction of the Finnish casualties inflicted on the Red Army. The importance lies in what he represented about the relationship between the Finnish soldier and his terrain. He was not using elaborate tactics. He was not using special equipment. He was using a rifle any Finnish farmer of the era would have recognized, in a forest he had known since childhood, applying to combat skills he had developed for hunting. The Soviets never developed an effective response to he or his equivalents. And this, more than any analysis of doctrine or equipment, reveals the fundamental problem with their approach to the Winter War. They brought to that forest a model of warfare that did not adapt to the terrain. German intelligence observed the Winter War with exceptional attention, and the conclusions German analysts drew from the data directly influenced the decisions Hitler would make 18 months later. About the invasion of the Soviet Union, an Oberkommando der Wehrmacht report dated February 1940, while the Winter War was still ongoing, assessed Soviet performance with words that reveal as much about German biases as about the reality they observed. The Red Army showed itself, in a difficult environment and against lesser than expected opposition, to be an instrument with fundamental problems of command, tactics, and training. The report concluded that Soviet strength, though numerically impressive, suffered from structural weaknesses that made it inadequate for high-speed, modern warfare operations. This conclusion would be used to justify Hitler's conviction that the Soviet Union could be toppled in 8 to 10 weeks. What the German report got right about the weaknesses of the 1940 Red Army, it got wrong by failing to recognize that many of those weaknesses were correctable, and that a system that had survived Finland through sheer human mass was perfectly capable of surviving other defeats the same way. But the truly important lesson of the Winter War, the lesson that both Soviets and Germans paid an enormous price for not learning sooner, was about the nature of the Finnish soldier and what he revealed about the limits of conventional military capability analysis. Colonel Allard, Erpason and head of intelligence forces during the wars, produced after the conflict an analysis that remains one of the most lucid documents on the nature of the Finnish advantage. We were not superior to the Soviets in any conventional resource, wrote Possonen. We were inferior in numbers, in tanks, in aviation, in artillery, in logistics. We were superior in exactly one thing. Each Finnish soldier knew why he was fighting, knew what he was fighting for, and knew the terrain on which he was fighting. When these three elements combine, a numerically inferior force can multiply its effectiveness by a factor that no conventional calculation adequately predicts. The peace treaty of March 1940 that ended the Winter War was, on the surface, a Soviet victory. Finland ceded 30% of the border was pushed away from Leningrad. Stalin's stated objectives were, formally, achieved. But the 105 days that cost the Red Army 126,000 confirmed dead, with estimates from modern historians reaching 100 plus 320,000 dead, 5,500 tanks lost, and 900 aircraft shot down had communicated something to the world that no peace treaty could erase. The Soviet Union, with all its industrial power and human mass, had taken more than 3 months to subdue a nation of 3 million people, and it had succeeded only by trading blood for time, never solving the fundamental problem that made each Finnish soldier the equivalent of several Soviets in the terrain. General Omar Bradley, studying the Finnish campaign from his American perspective, articulated a lesson that would resonate through all the asymmetric conflicts of the subsequent 20th century. The Winter War, Bradley said, taught anyone paying attention that the size of an army is a measure of its strength only on paper. In actual terrain, against soldiers who know and inhabit that terrain, the force multiplier for the defender can be so great that it completely reverses the numerical equation. Finland was not a miracle. It was mathematics applied to circumstances the Soviets refused to recognize. The Germans, who observed the Winter War and concluded that the Red Army was fundamentally weak, were committing the same error the Soviets had made regarding Finland, measuring an enemy's capability by their worst moments, and concluding those worst moments represented their normal level. Both the Soviets regarding Finland and the Germans regarding the Soviet Union would commit this error with devastating consequences. Finland had given the world a laboratory of asymmetric combat whose lessons were clear for anyone willing to study them without the distortions of ideology or bias. A defender who knows its terrain, who fights for reasons it deeply understands, and who possesses skills adequate to the specific environment of combat, can multiply its effectiveness in ways that no conventional order of battle analysis adequately captures. 126,000 Soviet dead in the Finnish winter of 1939 to 1940 constitute a monument to the consequence of ignoring this lesson. They died, ultimately, not because they were cowardly or incompetent soldiers. Many were brave men who fought with determination in terrible conditions. They died because the systems above them, ideological, political, military, made it impossible to see Finland as it actually was, rather than as Moscow needed it to be. If this story has seemed important to you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories like this, moments when leaders' assumptions collided with the reality of battlefields, with consequences that still echo today. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans the entire world, and every perspective enriches the conversation. Thank you for watching and for keeping these stories alive.